The most dangerous threats to modern democracy aren't unfolding in midnight coups, violent protests, or high-profile scandals, but rather in the sterile, fluorescent-lit rooms of state zoning meetings, where the very architecture of electoral power is being quietly and systematically disassembled. In a striking manifestation of this trend, lawmakers in Tennessee have aggressively targeted and dismantled the state's sole majority black congressional district, taking the vibrant, historically rich economic and cultural hub of Memphis and fracturing it into surrounding, overwhelmingly conservative strongholds. This localized event is not merely a geographic anomaly or a standard bureaucratic adjustment. It is a meticulously engineered political burglary executed in broad daylight, where state-level architects utilize ultra-precise census data and precinct histories to deliberately dilute minority influence under the thin, implausible guise of race-neutral map-making. Lawmakers feign total ignorance of the racial demographics of the areas they are dissecting, presenting an insulting facade of innocence while utilizing sophisticated software that can practically identify voter affiliations down to individual parking lots and neighborhoods. The underlying driver of this cartographic warfare is a profound existential demographic panic among the MAGA faction of the Republican Party, which acutely recognizes that its current policy agenda, ranging from controversial cultural edicts and aggressive regulatory rollbacks to rigid economic orthodoxies favoring wealth concentration, struggles to command a natural, sustainable national majority in an increasingly diverse society. Rather than adapting their platform, expanding their coalition, or engaging in the traditional democratic exercise of persuading voters, these political actors have opted to fundamentally rewrite the rules of the game by changing the electorate itself, leveraging advanced data analytics to pinpoint and structurally nullify opposition blocks down to the exact apartment complex or neighborhood cul-de-sac. This calculated tactical pivot from ideological persuasion to structural domination is heavily facilitated by a seemingly compliant right-wing judiciary, which frequently steps in to overturn voter-approved redistricting reforms in favor of highly partisan legislative maps, thereby creating an insulating ecosystem where procedural maneuvering consistently overrides the expressed popular will. The immediate, glaring consequence of cracking these historically cohesive communities is the effective pre-cooking of electoral outcomes, a maneuver that renders the actual act of casting a ballot a mere ceremonial formality in these heavily gerrymandered zones. When congressional and state districts are artificially engineered to be entirely impervious to natural demographic shifts or changing public sentiment, elected officials become completely insulated from broader public accountability. This deliberate insulation inherently incentivizes extreme legislative behavior because the only genuine threat to an incumbent's power comes from radical primary challengers rather than the moderate center of a general electorate. Economically, this targeted disenfranchisement acts as a silent but devastating form of resource starvation for urban centers like Memphis. Because their fractured electoral voices can no longer coalesce to demand equitable federal representation, these communities face severe disadvantages in securing crucial infrastructural funding, educational grants, and commercial development investments. On a broader, national level, this aggressive redistricting strategy effectively hollows out the foundational protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, audaciously treating a cornerstone of American civil rights legislation not as a living, necessary, protective covenant, but rather as an obsolete historical relic that no longer constrains state-level ambitions. By treating civil rights history as something frozen in the past rather than a continuous struggle, these legislative maneuvers attempt to freeze the balance of power, ensuring that minority citizenship is only tolerated when it is rendered politically powerless. The real risk lies in how key players respond. While the perpetrators of this extreme electoral engineering evidently believe that moving swiftly and decisively will irrevocably secure long-term systemic control and neutralize demographic destiny, such blatant, unapologetic disenfranchisement is already igniting fierce grassroots resistance, driving complex legal challenges, and forcing marginalized communities to innovate entirely new mechanisms for collective political and economic action. If the appellate courts and the Supreme Court of the United States continue to rubber stamp these highly partisan distortions, it could permanently institutionalize minority rule within the United States, a shift that would fundamentally alter the nation's geopolitical standing by severely undermining its moral authority and diplomatic credibility as a stable, representative democracy on the global stage. Authoritarian regimes abroad watch these domestic procedural maneuvers closely, utilizing America's internal democratic backsliding as a justification for their own oppressive practices, and a signal that the global champion of democratic norms is effectively compromised. Conversely, this blatant overreach might inadvertently catalyze a historic counter-mobilization, potentially overwhelming the newly constructed structural barriers through unprecedented coordinated voter turnout and sweeping state-level electoral revolts that bypass traditional federal bottlenecks. As we watch the foundational mechanics of civic representation being deliberately rewired to insulate powerful incumbents, from the rapidly changing demographics and evolving economic needs of the nation, we must confront a vital, unresolved dilemma. If the heavily engineered maps dictate the winners long before a single ballot is actually cast, what viable legislative or judicial mechanisms remain to ensure that a government genuinely reflects the will, economic priorities, and diversity of its populace?